how to call it, but a lot of embedded devices, a lot of manufacturers. Helped out at a place called Cyber Tech, mostly based in Washington, D.C. and in California. I'm a board member of OWASP and on the call for papers board for OWASP Cali. I also went to Northeastern here in Boston, so I was glad to come back home. And as Oliver said, I left after about 6 months ago to start my own startup. And we have a team of 5 working at Attack IQ, mostly on threat intelligence turned into attack scenarios. And that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 15 years, one way or another. You know, this is me on the left when I started. I was kind of young, dumb, just happy to have a job and kind of working. A lot of times on one product, looking at where to bypass that product, either finding vulnerabilities in it or actually trying to find out if it was a defensive product, how I could bypass it. And I was always focused on one product. And as I kind of matured in my career, and I started moving in other organizations, doing a lot more security architecture work and incident response work, I found out, you know, through a lot of practice, it's never about one product, it's about the security architecture, and it's about multiple products placed in the right spots in your infrastructure, protecting the right critical assets. And throughout that kind of discovery, and it was quick when I found that out, a lot of scenarios and mimicry had to happen where I was pretending to be the attacker and looking at those defensive products. So the title of the talk is Offensive Defense Through Attack Mimicry. The offensive defense talk I've done a few times, and it's kind of changed. So the last one was on looking at all the different types of mechanisms within security products, from signatures to heuristics, semantic aware detection, predictive analytics, machine learning, classifiers, and clustering technologies, and how each one has its pro, and how each one can be bypassed. Because it's incredibly important to know what you're buying when you buy a defensive product, but then understand its weaknesses. And if we look at the sum of all the products, holistically they will help us, but individually they only play one small part. So today, I'm going to talk about offensive defense through attack mimicry, and the importance that I found of attack scenarios. So the big problem at hand, this is probably very hard to read, is I found through doing a lot of architecture work, a lot of incident response work, that it's not working whatever we're doing. It's not working in terms of the products that we're buying and how we understand them. More networks than ever before, or more networks than we're ever aware of before, are being broken into. There's a huge reliance on vendors, and that's still the case, but it's more the case that we're, you know, as companies, buying threat intelligence feeds ourselves, understanding our products a little bit more, and really taking into our own hands what our future may lead to. And these security teams at various companies are trying to come to grasp with having more insight into the attacker TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Because really that's where it has to come to. You have to get to know the threats to combat them. And it's not a question of if you'll be broken into, it's when. So there's a lot of problems that I kept on seeing. You know, we always talk about compliance. Compliance is great from a baseline standpoint. We always have to do more. But a lot of times when I go to some companies that are not as mature and they figure that compliance is, the baseline is good enough. And what else can we do? And this is all leading up to attack scenarios and why they're extremely useful to kind of mature organizations. I was a penetration tester for a long time. I did a lot of incident response. Ian, who I believe is talking this year, talks about red teaming all the time. All extremely useful and will never end. Penetration testing is useful. But when you have a pen testing team come into your organization and look from the outside in, what they're doing is they're coming for maybe 2 weeks at a time, and they're looking at your network as it stands right now. 2 weeks after they leave, your network might change dramatically. It's very expensive to have them in, and so we have to be adaptive and look on certain solutions as to when our network's changing, what else can we look to? So, you know, a lot of the thinking that I had and one of the motivations when I was kind of growing up in high school and college was a paper by Dan Farmer called Improving the Security of Your Site by Breaking Into It. Does anybody remember that paper and ever read it? A few of you, okay. It really came down to better defense by acting like an attacker, right? And this kind of brought a birth of an industry. You know, you had vulnerability assessment tools, vuln scanners, exploit frameworks, web application security scanners. We were looking at the perimeter, and we were looking at what was vulnerable and how we were going to get inside the perimeter. So fast forward today, we have to stop only thinking about the perimeter and only thinking about prevention. We have to move past that. If the attackers are getting in, if the tools, the techniques, and the procedures that they're using are getting into our network, we have to start thinking at the core of our network. It's not that the attackers are so much more sophisticated, but there are so many more of them. And a lot of these commodity tools are used and being successfully deployed within our networks by these attackers and working. So we kind of have to start with this mentality of continual adaptation, agile IT security teams, thinking about security architecture, and really thinking about the assets in the core of our networks and hardening those from themselves. The traditional model of thinking, 90s, early 2000s, and earlier, was we have the internal network, that's trusted. Anything outside of the internal network, not trusted. It's very much changed. We have the internal network, and we have employees working from home coming in, employees working from a coffee shop coming in. We have employees going to unknown websites, bringing down executable code, be it JavaScript or actual Windows 32 or Linux binaries. We have remote offices connecting into internal networks. And the same while, we have devices within our network coming in, USB keys, laptops that we're not aware of. And given our particular security policy or any of the anomaly detection we have, we've set certain thresholds in place to say, well, this laptop is never meant to talk to our source code repository, or if it is, it's never supposed to do that past 8 p.m. And so there's a lot of technological, technology put inside of our network to kind of mitigate what could happen. So here's where attack mimicry kind of plays a part. So attack mimicry enables an organization to measure their security posture against real-world attackers. One of the greatest cases was 2 years ago, the New York Times, when they were hacked into, and they questioned their vendor. It's all public if you want to look up who that vendor was. They were only running desktop antivirus. And they said, well, why weren't we protected? And the vendor said, well, you don't have the right tools for those type of attacks. Well, was it the job of the New York Times to know that, or was it the job of the vendor to actually recommend the right tools? And it really helps to understand what are real-world attacks, where's your risk posture, what should you be worried about, so that when you jump in the ring and your site's live, your network's live, and it's accessible to the public internet, where do you stand? So it's very important to start knowing your attacker. And if I had to walk around, how many of you walked around RSA this year? So last few years it was cloud. Now it's predictive analytics and threat intelligence. Those are the two big kind of pushes this year. Threat intelligence is incredibly important, but it's important in the right context and used in the right way. So it's going to help organizations to get to know the attacker that's trying to penetrate their networks. And then once inside their networks, staying dormant, moving around, understanding the network, performing recon, moving around laterally, and exfiltrating data. So a lot of organizations, a lot of times are just focused on the hash of the malware. Oh, we caught another hash. What was that? That hash of that malware, and they're trading samples, and they're just trading hashes. You have to take a step above, kind of a bird's eye view, and look abstractly, going, what were the techniques? What type of tools were they using? And take that type of step as opposed to only looking at binary. Because those binaries could be polymorphic. They could be changing every single time they come into your organization. What are the techniques that those binaries are using to move laterally, to exfiltrate data, to do any tunneling, to do any type of dumping hashes? I like this quote, if anybody can read it. So this is from John Lambert, General Manager at Trustworthy Computing. So he says 90% of attacker time in an intrusion uses only built-in OS tools. Too bad the security industry focuses only on the 10% that is mutable malware. So to my point, we focus too much on that individual malware that's coming in, and not once they're in, what are they doing? How can we stop them? How can we contain them? And how can we limit what they're able to do to try to move around and make the problem worse, which is get to our critical data, get to our intellectual property, get to our trade secrets or innovation, and actually exfiltrate it out. So this is something that I'm talking about, which is continual adaptation of defensive strategy based on threat intelligence. So there are more vendors than I can think of that do threat intelligence feeds, sticks, OpenIOCs, and a few other formats that come down, and you have to consume them in one way or another. Okay, let's see how this goes. So as those threats as those threat feeds are coming in, we have to figure out what are we doing with them, how are we consuming them. And this is an ongoing conversation because it is not easy. Those just don't, in many cases, just fit into every single product that you've actually deployed in your organization. It's important to understand the attacker's plan, the attacker's motive, their capability, their techniques, tactics, and procedures, TTPs, what campaigns they're running, and when they do, what tools do they actually use. And on the defense side, understanding the defense capability. What course of action, given what type of motive the attacker might have. And this is continually changing as we get to know, as we get to the attacker. Alright, so as this is continually changing, this is kind of a quick sense of what we're looking at in our organization. So not all organizations, but hopefully most, have a security policy. From a technology standpoint and usability standpoint, what's acceptable within that organization. They've, at some point, hopefully looked at segments of their security architecture and identified the critical assets that they're trying to protect, and hopefully figured out which products make sense around which of those assets. More organizations are buying intelligence feeds, but IOC, CTPs, but also part of the reason when we get compromised, because we will, we learn from that incident response. We learn from what we found, what are the attackers, what are those tools, and those go back into our intelligence feeds, and we use that again in the circle. One of the benefits that I'm saying today, as I go into some detail, that comes next is to, from that threat intelligence, the attackers that are going after us, and the tools that they're using, there's a huge amount of benefit of actually generating a scenario from that. A scenario that's going to test your controls, those security controls that you assume work in a certain way. It's incredibly important to validate that. So as you understand the techniques, the tactics, the tools that are used, validate all those assumptions. And it's not only the products on your end, but it's the process that you put in place. It's the people that you put in place and train, including myself. You know, we ran a lot of, this is normally called red teaming exercises, but it's becoming a lot more mainstream when you actually just throw an attack on everyone, and either you know about it or you don't know about it, and let's see how we handle it. This is going to become a lot more mainstream than we all think. So the last two sections are vulnerability scanning, which we already do, remediation, patching, prioritization, improving, monitor, and survive the next attack. And as we get to know when we run an attack scenario, how well we did, we figure out where the weaknesses are, and then we can improve within those weaknesses. Only when you actually test yourself, just like, you know, when any of us were in school, you think you know the material, until that test rolls around, you really don't know if you know that material. And it's being tested in the right way, not just being tested, but being tested in the context that an attacker would come in, and coming as close to that as possible. So in an incident response, it's changing the nature of that as well. So as we detect, we respond, we analyze, we still let intel. It's bringing that into our threat feed into information. It's bringing that into our creation of attack scenarios that we'll run, either letting the team know or not letting the team know, if that's a true red team exercise. And then adding that to the intelligence of how we're actually making decisions in our security architecture. So the benefits of attack mimicry or attack scenarios is that we can validate the current security control assumption. As I said, and of those of you who are kind of in charge of networks know, your network is constantly changing. And what I'm kind of proposing is not that you run an attack scenario or mimic an attack once, but that it is continually happening. And it's continually happening in such a way that is not invasive, if possible, given the scenario, and that it's continually testing the most critical controls that you can test. And as those are changing, and the assets around them are all changing, it's important to match the TTPs with the security control functionality. So these attacker capabilities and the defensive capabilities, do they match up? And it's continually going to change. But at least there's an assumption that's made and it's validated. Once you understand the TTPs and the security controls, then you can kind of step back and look at, well, if the attacker's doing this and I have these defensive controls, these are individual defensive controls, security controls. If the attacker was to come and compromise this one machine, and I understand that their lateral tools and their capability is this, how can I mitigate the circumstances of that attacker, contain that attacker so that they're not able to go to the next machine? A lot of times our mentality is they've gotten into one machine, game over. And a lot of times in some of the security mailing lists I'm on, that's all they talk about. The attacker got in. Well, they got in to a critical machine or not to a critical machine, because it means all the difference. Once they got in, were they able to do anything else? Were they on a machine that had critical information? Or were they stopped and detected it right then? So it's kind of the mentality has changed from prevent to react very quickly. So once you're able to actually look at your architecture and understand the capabilities of the attacker and your defensive capabilities, you can introduce kill chains. Kill chains as far as they were able to do this, and remember, an attack isn't just 0, 1, 2, 3. It's a whole chain of events that happens. So somewhere along the line, you can weaken one of those chains and make it so expensive for them to try that next, whatever they need to do to get to that machine that they just stop. So really running these attack scenarios improves your ability to confine an infection. Again, I want to stress that when you run these should be one-off exercises. They are now because we don't do them as much. But I'm seeing more organizations run them. Mind you, larger organizations. I'm hoping that's going to trickle down and there's going to be more work done across the whole industry so that we can all kind of benefit. But once we start to benefit, we're talking about automation, running the scenarios in a smaller fashion, in an automated fashion, making it reproducible. So imagine the scenario that there is a compromise within your organization, and you make an architectural change. You add this product, you move this asset here, and then in most cases, what does most organizations do? They then walk away and cross their fingers that mitigation strategy has solved the problem. Instead, I'm proposing that we start running an attack scenario that validates that change. And in some organizations that happens, but not in most. But if it's automated and it's reproducible, then you reduce the risk. Because it's the same every single time, so you know what to expect. If I'm to take the latest, Zeus binary, I'm not going to run that in my organization to see how well I do. But if I can create an attack scenario that mimics what happens in that case, and I understand the boundaries, and I know I can reproduce it every single time, I'm more likely to do that to see how well I hold up. The other thing that's very beneficial for attack mimicry or attack scenarios is, as most kind of IT risk groups know, they do their day-to-day job, and a lot of times an executive will come after reading something in the paper and say, hey guys, hey girls, how do we do? How do we hold up against this particular attack? And that's something we've always had to deal with. And by mimicking an attack scenario to something that aligns with something we've read about, we can give not a definitive answer, but we can give an answer to kind of the C-level who's asking us how well do we hold up to this attack. Attack scenarios are also kind of long-term thinking. As we kind of start piling up a repository of attack scenarios, we can justify the changes, the data-driven changes to our architecture. Why did you make that change? Why do we need this product? Why do we need to make the change in this segment? It's because of these particular attack scenarios that are real. So, okay. So this is a slide of the common phases of an attack. So typically you have the intelligence gathering, a lot of reconnaissance. You have the point of entry, via a web app, spear phishing, a number of different methods. Once the malware or hands-on keyboard attacker actually gains access to your internal network infrastructure, the command and control channel is typically established. Normally the downloader is brought down and then further functionality brought down into the infrastructure. The attacker will then try to gain persistence, and there's a number of different ways. Lateral movement to other machines in the infrastructure, or other assets in the infrastructure, gaining access to the various databases or repository stores, and then exfiltrating that data out. From my from my standpoint, I think we've done a pretty good job of testing the point of entry. You know, there's a lot of tools out there, a lot of products out there that already say, can we get in via exploits, via spear phishing. What I'm more concerned with is once we're in, how can we move around and how can we get out? Because that's a huge concern, I think, to many companies and many organizations. So let's look at a few examples. So there's two ways that I always look at scenarios. Well, there's a few ways, but I'm only going to mention two here. Scenarios are built from events. I read this particular event, a piece of malware, a particular attack group did such, or I am familiar with this type of technique, and I've seen enough groups, enough compromises happen that I just want to build a scenario from this technique. So scenarios from events that we focus on a lot is CryptoLocker was a huge test for it in people, processes, and tools. The Zeus binary, which had a 64-bit driver, it was digitally signed, but it had a bogus certificate. Very interesting to see if any of the products were able to pull that off. Target actually had a lot of known hacking tools. Poison Ivy. How many of you have heard Poison Ivy? Oh, many of you. Okay. I always want to call it a commodity attacker toolkit now. It's used by a lot of the known attacker groups, but it's almost a given that Poison Ivy will be found somewhere if I'm doing an incident response kit. So Poison Ivy allows custom names. For the dropper, the mutex. It allows you to bind to any processes. There's a lot of functionality with Poison Ivy, and so there's a lot of purpose into actually creating some scenarios around Poison Ivy. Scenarios are built from techniques: pass the hash, stolen private SSH keys. And once we've gained access to do VPN or proxy tunneling, so understand that most of these scenarios that, well, I'm personally interested in, and the companies that I've worked with are personally interested in, are after infection. Because in many cases, after infection, most of these companies find out not by their own security team, but by outside authorities, either companies that they work for, law enforcement, a number of other organizations let them know that they've been infected. So one of the top priorities for most organizations should be realizing what's going on internally. Continue to worry about the perimeter, but start to wonder what's going on internally and be able to react quickly. So pass the hash is a lateral technique. Stolen private SSH keys, in many cases, also a lateral technique. Once you have the keys and a password is not necessary. VPN proxy tunneling is a way to still go through, in many cases, the primary aspect, but it looks like VPN traffic, so it's not going to be as monitored. So it's cut off a little bit. So CryptoLocker. Ransom, so those of you who are not familiar with it, it's ransomware Trojan, which targets Windows machines, came around last year. So the infection, phishing email, and a lot of targeted attacks, some APTs come in this way. Zip files, inside the zip files was the executable, and in many cases the email is very convincing. You know, it's UPS, FedEx. You want to open up the zip file. There's a reason to open up the zip file. Once you open up the zip file, it's an executable, and that's a lure to basically execute that binary, and hugely successful. Once the infection happens, there's CNC communication using a domain generation algorithm. How many of you are familiar with DGA's domain generation algorithm? Good, I'll talk about that a little bit. And the goal was to then scan the physical and map network drives on your computer and encrypt them using public and private key, public keys. And then demand a ransom of $300, hundreds of $300 to decrypt your files. You had a pop-up that said, we'll decrypt it for $300. So let's look at each one of those phases. So how can we build some type of attack scenario that will help us understand, had we been infected by CryptoLocker, are there portions of the products, the tools, the processes, the people in place that would have helped us? So in the case of the CNC communication, this is a technique that is used in a number of pieces of malware, which is to create a domain generation algorithm, or it has a domain generation algorithm within the code. It's going to take the time, it'll take the day, and it'll create a domain. And it's agreed upon with the CryptoLocker crew. They understand they have the same algorithm, and they're going to register only a few of those domains, and we're going to generate a few of those domains in the CryptoLocker binary, and we're going to try to reach those domains. And we're only going to register that day or the day before. So it's, in a sense, dynamically created based off the day, what domain that binary will be contacting. The DGAs are hugely popular. This is a technique that products have put techniques in place, and put capabilities in place to understand that it's a DGA, dynamically generated algorithm. And when you look at a lot of these URLs, it looks like garbage. It does not look like human consumable. It does not look like something that a human would say, you know, that's a good domain name. Let me register that. This is a long string. You know, it looks very random. So to that point, what we're going to test is we're going to test any of the products that have been put in place, any of the web filtering products that might have stopped that CNC communication, or any of the network products that might have stopped that CNC communication, or in this case, the DNS products. If you're using something like OpenDNS, that might have stopped this type of communication. So DGA mimicry, so creating an attack scenario that once access has been granted to that machine, generate a number of randomly generated domains and try to contact those domains. And the products in place, in many cases, they're using Shannon entropy, they're using Markov chains, a number of these different types of technologies to look at the randomness of that domain. And in most cases, they will stop it. They will prevent that from happening. But it's good to take those assumptions and validate those assumptions. I know that OpenDNS, for example, had an amazing amount of visualization. They did a very good job of protecting a lot of their organizations from CryptoLocker based off that technique. So scanning, next CryptoLocker would scan the local file system and some of the drives, try to look for particular file extensions to start encrypting. So in this particular case, you're not going to look at the CPU or the I/O, disk I/O load. That's going to have way too many false positives. But a lot of products out there have started planting, you know, honeypots, honey tokens out on particular drives, deeply buried inside of many folders where no one would or should go. And if something is completely randomly scanning as far as the tree will go, then I've seen some products shoot off an alarm to say, we're being scanned, there's a file scan, and there's an alarm that's raised. This is a little tougher one because it's done so regularly, especially with actual defensive and security products scanning the entire drive. But certainly, there's definitely some possibilities there. But you would want to potentially test that. So some of the ways that CryptoLocker was prevented against was creating software restriction policies, saying where binaries and other files should actually exist. Now, if you put that in place, to the attack scenario that we created for CryptoLocker would put it in the exact place that CryptoLocker was adding in the application files, application data files. But a lot of other malware that we saw, we didn't just do it because CryptoLocker did it. We did it because we saw a lot of other files doing it. And it's only a red team exercise if we actually want to start encrypting all the files and then shoot off an email of alert saying, hey, the entire disk has been encrypted. Somebody should do anything. That's really, that's a red team exercise, which our attack scenario didn't go into. So IceFog is an APT group that Kaspersky was following. We were in some communications with Kaspersky as they started releasing public information. We didn't get anything that anybody else didn't get, but we had a lot of communications with them. The IceFog is a group that has a lot of lateral movement tools. Nothing that we haven't really seen. Password and hash dumping tools that dump in an Explorer state passwords, tools that dump Outlook email account passwords, debugging tools, and a lot of times you'll see 7-zip or RAR programs to actually zip them up and exfiltrate that data. The three main types of stolen data in a particular instance that Kaspersky blogged about was the Windows address books, documents including Excel and document files, user account credentials. They would split the files and then exfiltrate it out. One thing to mention is that they exfiltrated it out a number of different ways. They actually sent out an email, I believe, to an AOL address. They used a direct proxy, and then they just went through direct CNC to not a standard port. So a lot of times when we're mimicking in an attack scenario some of these tools, one of the top aspects that will mimic is the lateral movement of dumping passwords. Windows, unfortunately, and fortunately, I guess, depends on how you look at it, caches your password as a hash when you log into the machine. The reason that they do that is in the case that you're logging in and you're authenticating yourself via your domain credentials. And the case that that machine that you're logging into can't contact the domain controller, it'll hash it'll cache the hash of the password. So you can log in even if it can't contact the domain controller. But because of that, if an attacker gains access to your machine, it can dump the hash of your password of someone who's previously logged into the local administrator account, and then use that to actually move lateral. And this is by far one of the largest techniques that's used. And really, it's an attack scenario that we've employed. And the only way to really mitigate those circumstances is to actually create a unique admin password on almost every machine. And Microsoft released a tool called Admin PWD to help kind of manage that. I haven't seen anybody, does anybody use that tool? I'm just curious. No? Okay. I haven't seen anybody really, I haven't seen that deployed massively. Another problem with a lot of the hashing passwords is a lot of times if you're in charge of a large network, you'll create a standard image, and that's the image that you'll use to actually push out to all the massive amounts of assets that you have. And if you log into that image, that asset, before deploying it out as a domain admin, then it's cached in the image that you're pushing out. So a lot of times pushing that standard image, if you've logged in once a day as an administrator, is a problem. Also, the aspect of restricted access. So although you have admin creds on one machine, the ability to log into an adjacent machine, if you can restrict any access, it's very difficult to do in many cases given a particular network segment, but it's one of the recommendations. So for any of the data that was stolen out, that was actually exfiltrated, you have to think, those of you that use data leakage prevention of any sort, would my DLP solution have stopped it? So let's test my DLP solution. Most DLP solutions are not geared to handle attackers. They're geared to handle policy violators. Those that didn't know it, but by mistake wanted to send that document to their Gmail account. But not those who really knew what they were doing, splitting up the information in such a way, encrypting the information in such a way, and then exfiltrating that information. But it's good if you're told on the phone when you're buying a DLP solution that does this, to actually have a scenario to test against, to then come back to that product and say, you know, your product is very valuable to me, but it doesn't do what you just said. And so it allows you to have more knowledge about the products that you're being sold. The data exfiltration through a proxy is an interesting one. This is a technique that we see quite often. And you have to ask yourself, how does your organization handle VPNing or proxy tunneling out of your organization? How do you handle it in your policy from a technology standpoint? Because malware commonly uses VPN or proxies to exit your network. I stated this at the beginning, so a lot of times the attack scenarios that we create are very custom. And they're custom, well, I say 50% of them are custom. And they're custom based off, we'll talk to an organization and they made some architectural changes and they want to validate those changes. So we ask what controls have been put in place, what are the assumptions that have been made, and from that standpoint, what is the scenario that we could create that would mimic when the attacker got in and the controls that they put in place to validate that those new controls do indeed add mitigations, add a mitigation to what did happen. So there's one particular group, 4H. 4H stays persistent by injecting a legitimate DLL that's going to be loaded by a Windows process, by injecting that legitimate DLL with code to actually load up another DLL that's malicious. A lot of whitelisting technologies look at the executables, but in many cases don't look at the DLLs for hot patching reasons, for a lot of other reasons. There's a lot of false positives in whitelisting, although that's a very strict policy to take. So this is something interesting. We've seen executables be infected to actually load a malicious DLL, but we've never seen before a DLL be infected to load other DLLs. Since we saw that in this particular group, that's an attack scenario that we created. As we see more groups, as we see more techniques, adding to that scenario repository is incredibly important so that that's reproducible. So that every single security control you actually have, then you can test against it. The only way that we actually suggested then was DLL and process monitoring. There's a few different technologies out there that will not necessarily make the exact decision for you, but let you know that that process has changed in memory in real time. So exploit mimicry. So for the most part, we focus on attack scenarios after the initial infection, but it's important to, and that's the main reason is because we don't want to be too invasive. But it is important to test exploitation to a certain point, mainly on the network, I would say. There's enough tools out there doing actual exploitation and frameworks. We don't focus on that. What we do have is a technique, and we're not the first to do this, which is to say that we want to test an exploit going across the wire, but we don't want to corrupt memory. We don't want to actually exploit that machine. But we want to see, and we want to test, and we want to validate our controls if we would actually throw an exploit along the wire that's going to exploit this service, and we want to see what would happen before that happens. And we also want to know, once it hits that service, how well would that process handle that type of exploit. So there's attack scenarios that you can create where the actual client that's going to be exploited, so to say, and the actual server that's going to send the exploit come to an agreement. And the client can actually poke the process that we're interested in exploiting, poke it, and we come to a protocol communication agreement, and you'll know, given a cryptographic key of some sort, the actual exploit, if it actually has a header, that is the right party that it will take in memory that shellcode and execute on the client, ever without having to execute that exploit. It's a client-server agreement. It's a technique that a lot of different attack scenario firms have used before. But you can test in that way the exploit running along the wire, moving from the wire into memory, and then actually the client side determining its capabilities, ASLR, depth, given knowledge of that exploit. There's a lot of things that you can test. The most important thing to test, though, is internal network and all the techniques and the tactics and procedures that an attacker has. So, conclusion, I really think that we need to start focusing on an inside-out approach. Not to say that we should stop focusing on vulnerability scanners looking from the outside in, but we need to start looking at the assets within our network, wondering how they can get to one another, restrictive policies, looking at anomaly detection. What's baseline is very hard to do, but creating some sense of what's normal within my infrastructure and what's normal for my infrastructure to do outside of my infrastructure. Threat intelligence is going to be more and more important to all of us, but it's threat intelligence used in the right way and that we can consume it, and that threat intelligence directly changes how we make decisions on our security architecture. Once we make those changes, it's incredibly important to have some way to validate those changes. Attack scenarios, attack mimicry is one way to do that. This is a line that I always like. If you're in the business of defending an infrastructure, you need to know how well your people, processes, and tools are resisting modern threat actors and their techniques, tactics, and procedures. If you're defending your infrastructure, you seriously need to know what you're after. You can't just sit there, buy some products, and just cross your fingers and hope for the best. Attack scenarios are not only for red team exercises, they're really for security control validation. So with that, is there any questions? All right. Well, I'll be up here afterwards. I'll be here for the next 2-3 days. Stop me, ask me any questions you'd like. Thank you very much.